In the previous video, we discussed factors that affect a country's population growth rate, and the four factors that can affect it are the death rate, which humans have decreased across the globe through improved healthcare, improved sanitation, and improved nutrition, and we talked about different ways in which we've done that. Increasing the birth rate would also increase the number of humans. Decreasing the birth rate would decrease the population growth rate. So birth rate and death rate are the big ones. But then also immigration and emigration have an effect as well. Those four factors will determine the population growth rate or how fast the population is shrinking. In terms of the human population growth rate, the total human population growth rate on Earth, it's about 1.2% annually. So if the current population is 7.9 billion people and the population growth rate is annually 1.2%, we would expect that after we take all the new humans that are born this year and subtract all of the humans that died this year, we would net about 95 million people. So the population figure would increase by about 95 million. There would be more people born, but we are subtracting the number who died as well. Now that's globally. As I said, in less developed countries, the population growth rate is much higher, and in highly developed countries, it's much, much lower. So in more developed countries, the annual population growth rate is about 0.2%, and in less developed countries, it's about 1.5%. You can see from this table here, the annual birth rate per 1,000 people is about 21 globally, and death rate per 1,000 people is 8, right? So you could see that, hey, if we're getting 21 births for every 8 deaths per 1,000 people on Earth, of course our population is growing. In more developed countries, though, if we're only getting 12 births for every 10 deaths, well, then it makes sense that our population would be growing, but much slower. And in less developed countries, if we're having 23 births for every 8 deaths per 1,000 people, then it makes sense that not only would the population be growing, but much faster than the global average. And you can do interesting kind of crude mathematics with this. There are mathematical tricks you can use with some of these numbers. You can take a look at the population growth rate, and you can estimate the amount of time it'll take any given population to double by taking the number 70 and dividing it by that growth rate. It doesn't work out perfectly, but it's a good approximation. The US population growth rate, including migration and emigration, is about 0.73% annually. So if we take the number 70 and we divide it by 0.73, we come to about 95.9 years. It'll take the US population almost a century before it doubles, right? Before we have twice as many people in the United States. We're growing pretty darn slowly. And honestly, given how much space we have in the United States and our abundance of resources, that's a pretty manageable pace. The world population growth rate is currently up here, it's rounded to about 1.2%, but I have this number from 2016, which was a little bit more updated, and it has 1.13%. And it is about 61.9 years for the global population to double, to go from 7.9 billion to effectively 16 billion, or very close to 16 billion. And that is a lot less manageable. Now, I kind of doubt that we'll ever hit that population figure because, as I noted, our population growth rate is slowing down over time. So as we get a larger and larger population, the population growth rate has been slowing down on that logistic growth curve as though we are approaching a new carrying capacity. We don't know what that new carrying capacity is. Could be 10 billion humans, could be 12 billion humans. There are different estimates out there. But what this figure should tell you is that if there is indeed a carrying capacity somewhere in that range, 10 billion humans, 12 billion humans, it's not going to be very long before we find out what it is. We're talking within our lifetimes, we are going to find out. And remember that the locations where that population growth is going to be the most intense, where we're going to have the largest population density, are already the locations where resources are the least abundant. So this is going to shape up into quite a bit of a conflict. So slowing population growth rates is a concern for a lot of countries. What are some ways that they can accomplish this? Some sort of state policy that could be put into place, or some programs that they could create in order to slow the population growth rate? One methodology that the book suggests is reducing poverty, reducing income inequality, creating economic stimulation for people who are at the lowest income rungs of society. You may recall that one of the reasons I cited that it may be financially advantageous to have a large family, to have lots and lots of kids, is that you're getting all of your money from growing food on your own farm. Like, that's where all your food is sourced from, and that's also your source of income. But if you have more employment opportunities, more different methods of making money, or you have other revenue streams available to you, then the calculation of the value of a large family becomes slightly different, and families will make alternate choices, or some of them will, at least, maybe not all of them. So the idea here is economic development. By stimulating business opportunities, industry, creating job opportunities in some of these less developed countries, that creates a situation where the calculation has been changed, and maybe families will be smaller. Now, part of the requirement for that to work is that workers would have to be paid a fair wage, because otherwise it's not going to reduce poverty or income inequality. Another solution is to elevate the status of women as part of your society, and that also slows down the population growth rate somewhat. If women are part of the workforce and they have roles other than being mothers and part of the family unit, then family units will tend to be smaller. Again, these are generalities. If they have access to education, they can pursue higher degrees, they can pursue other types of careers, then they will tend to perhaps put off having a family till later in life, and those family units will again maybe be smaller. And the same would go for men. If you have more educational opportunities and career opportunities, they also would put off creating a family until later, and because they're not starting early on, maybe that family would end up being smaller as well, or they simply don't have time for a big family, so they keep it to 1 or 2 kids. But the reason why it specifically cites the status of women, 2 reasons. One, as I mentioned in a previous video, the population growth rate is much more strongly tied to the number of women in a population than it is the number of men. And it is also much more common that educational and career opportunities are denied to women than men. So by elevating the status of women, you're going to have a much more profound effect. This also might create a situation where now you have 2 revenue streams in a family where formerly you just had 1. And if you make family planning options available, contraception, abortion rights, the ability to decide when you are going to have that family, when you're going to start that family. Maybe you're going to have the family of the same size, but you're going to delay it by a few years. That would slow the population growth rate. In a little bit, I'm going to show you some information about a concept called the demographic transition, and incorporates some of these ideas. As a country moves forward in terms of economic development, technological development, and social development, and one of the aspects of that is the status of women increasing, the population growth rate will slow down over time. And we have data from watching countries go through this transition where we actually can watch this happen in real time. So our textbook wants us to look at 2 countries in particular because they are the most populated countries on the planet. And the first one is India. Last time I updated this slide looks like 2019, and the population of India was 1.339 billion people. Let me take a look at what the current population of India is. Okay, I'm recording this in February of 2022. Top result says that there are 1.38 billion people in India. So that means that in 3 years, the population has added an additional 40 million people to it. For scale, I think it would be somewhere in the vicinity of about 5 New York cities worth of new people added over 3 years. Its annual growth rate is 1.6%, so it's about 8 times higher than the one that we had cited on an earlier slide for the United States. Again, this data has to be updated all the time, so this is data it's a little out of date. It's not going to be that far off. But that's down from a high in the 1970s of about 2.3%. If you do the trick that we talked about, the rule of 70, where you take the number 70, you divide it by the annual growth rate, you divide 70 by 2.3, you would find that the population would double about every 30 years, which means that if you lived to, honestly, not even that old of an age, so say you lived to 60, you would expect at a growth rate of 2.3% to see the population quadruple during the course of your life, because it would double by the time you're 30, and then it would double again by the time you were 60. That's really fast. It was the country which had the world's first national family planning program, which began in 1952. This relied heavily on paid sterilization campaigns. So they offered some money to anyone who was willing to choose to become sterilized, to be go through a medical procedure where they would no longer be able to have children. Very, very few men agreed to this. It was almost entirely women, and the amount of money they were paid was trivial. I don't have the exact figure, but if I recall, it was somewhere in the order of around like $20. You'd have to convert and then update the figure for current day dollars, but it was a very small amount of money, honestly. But if you are not financially secure, that might be what you have to do in order to get by. So the people who went through the sterilization procedure were disproportionately those in the lowest rungs of the economic ladder, the people who were poor and economically disenfranchised. And I have this note here. It was actually a very widespread program, about 37% of women going through this. So it did have an effect of decreasing the population growth rate. As you can see, the annual growth rate is down. But it is still a policy which, even though everyone who went in was going in voluntarily, is preying on the fact that those who do not have a lot of money do not have a lot of choice or options. So it's not great on that front. In addition, the conditions of the operating rooms where these procedures were taken out were not reported to be particularly good. They were not very sterile conditions. They weren't necessary, and there were a number of women who died during these operations. So India is actually a massive economy, but they have a very large population. And because of the population size, they're actually home to about 1/3 of the world's poor, according to our textbook. That's the figure they cite. And a lot of the environmental problems that we've discussed, water scarcity issues, depletion of soil nutrients, erosion, overgrazing, overharvesting, cutting down of natural habitats, all of these, they are very large problems in India because of the population density. Another reason behind the population growth rate that your book cites, that I haven't mentioned yet, and this is true of India and the next country we'll talk about, China, is a cultural preference for male children. So families will keep having kids in the hopes that they will produce a male child at some point, and that increases the average number of children that any given family is going to have as well. So for the next case study, we have China. I have this number from 2013, says 1.386 billion people. I'm going to take a look at what it is. Top result says population of China, 1.4 billion people. So that says about 14 million people have been added in the past 9 years. Take that with a grain of salt, because the census data might not be totally accurate, but comparing that growth rate to what we saw from India on the previous slide, just in the time since I last updated these PowerPoint slides, that kind of shows you that India is closing that gap, that they are still growing faster than China is growing. Since 1972, they have reduced their total fertility rate from 5.7 down to 1.5. Again, total fertility rate is the average number of children born to a woman in her reproductive years. So we went from about 5.7 children on average to about 1.5 children on average. And part of this is due to their kind of infamous one-child policy. From 1979 to 2016, most couples were allowed only one child, or they would pay fines. I'm going to read the section of this from your textbook just directly here. In the 1960s, China's large population was growing so rapidly that there was a serious threat of mass starvation. To avoid this, government officials took measures that eventually led to the establishment of the world's most extensive, intrusive, and strict family planning and birth control program. The goal has been to sharply reduce population growth and avoid mass starvation and social upheaval by promoting one-child families. The government provides contraceptives, sterilizations, and abortions for married couples. In addition, married couples pledging to have no more than one child receive a number of benefits, including better housing, more food, free healthcare, salary bonuses, preferential job opportunities for their child. Couples who break the pledge lose such benefits. It does not mention the fines, or if you cannot pay the fine, any other additional punishments that might come through. This was a very strict policy. Now, the one we discussed for India was optional, right? Whether or not you went through the sterilization campaign, totally optional. And here, these sterilizations are also optional, but the one-child policy itself was mandated. However, if you are a wealthy person, you do not necessarily see a fine the same way that a person who does not have a lot of money sees a fine. If you have lots and lots of money and someone tells you that this is illegal and this is the fine you would have to pay if you do that thing, ultimately that just becomes the price that you need to pay in order to do the thing that you want to do, like have multiple children. So if you are willing to pay that fine to have more children, and you are a wealthy person, you would just pay that fine. So this too is a policy that disproportionately affects those with lower income. And those are the people for whom having more children is more of an economic benefit. In addition, there's still the cultural importance on having male children. So a couple is more likely to keep a child that is male than they would be likely to keep a child that is female. And this has actually led to an interesting demographic shift where a large portion of China's population now is male as a result of the one-child policy. There's a unevenness, an unbalance of the population, more men than women. Another issue stemming from this is that there was a massive population of individuals in the 1950s, and then they started only having one child at a time, right? Very suddenly, we shifted the number of offspring that we were producing. And that means that the population age diagram became top heavy. I'll show you it later, and it'll make more sense maybe when I say it, but there are more old people, more elderly people in China than there are young people to support them. And when I say support them, I mean financially through taxes, because that's how we support the elderly, is young people with jobs pay taxes, and then that tax money goes into social programs to help support the elderly, but also in extended family units, right? Like multi-generational homes are one way that we take care of the elderly. And having live-in nurses and care workers and people that staff retirement homes, right? We simply have more elderly people to take care of in a situation like this, and not enough younger people to perform those care services or create the economic stimulation that would create the funding for those care services. So you can get kind of strange results when you create a policy like this. The population growth rate, however, has definitively slowed down, and that the slowing it down has avoided mass starvation. However, some observations have pointed out that China also went rapid industrialization and economic development over the same period of time, and it's possible that the population growth rate would have slowed down about the same amount simply by virtue of those economic factors without the one-child policy in place. So you can see on this chart how high their annual population growth rate was right before the 1970s, and then once the policy is instituted, that population growth rate drops and until it's below the United States' population growth rate. China is still the most populous country in the world, but India will likely overtake it pretty soon. If you're wondering about this spike on the chart right here, where it actually dips down to a negative 1% annual growth rate in the 1960s, look up Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward. It was a period of time where it was an attempt at rapid industrialization, where all of the food being grown was grabbed up to overfill quotas for production and export, and none of it was given to the people. In some cases, a lot of the, I'm going to say, reckless building of industry and mining and things like that led to pollution runoff, which destroyed some of the croplands and fields, which then limited the ability to produce new crops, and that led to a large famine, which is one of the largest famines in human history. So that's what that dip is right there on the chart. All right, so those were our two case studies in slowing population growth. Both of them having some success with their policies. Both have problems with their policies. My intent is not to vilify or promote either of these policies, simply to describe what these two countries did in response to a rapidly growing population and what the effects of those policies were. Now, a moment ago, I mentioned how these policies affect the age structure of the populations, and that's another thing that demographers are going to look at. If you have a population with a lot more elderly individuals than you do people in their reproductive years, then the population birth rate is going to be lower than a population with the same size, but with more people in their reproductive years than you have elderly people. Because the older a person is, the less likely they are going to be to settle down, start a family, and begin having some more kids. So an elderly population is going to have a lower population birth rate. And not to be morbid, but they will also probably have a higher mortality rate, a higher death rate as well. So a population that is kind of top heavy in terms of age structure will likely have a much slower growth rate than a population of the same size with more people in the younger age category. On the other hand, if your population has lots of kids, you have lots and lots of young people, that means that there is a population wave, a baby boom, right? That in 10 years, 20 years now, 30 years, they are going to be the reproductive population of your group, of your country. And you're going to have a massive number of people that are starting families of their own. So that huge chunk of children that you have, they are going to be making even more kids. So if you know that you have a lot of offspring right now, a lot of young people, you can start planning for your country to increase the amount of infrastructure because you know there's going to be another population surge in a couple decades. So the age structure of a population is the distribution of individuals among age groups, and the structure provides insight into the history of a population, reproductive success, and how the population relates to environmental factors. You can get information about what's happened to a population in the past by just looking at the age structure diagram. It's almost like looking at tree rings, if you're familiar with that idea. Up here at the top of the slide, I have a population of witches and wizards, mostly pulled from Harry Potter, but you can see I grabbed a couple of other things in there to balance out the roster. I wanted everyone to be recognizable. So we have a couple of individuals here, way over here at the left, that are children. They will go into an age category that we refer to as pre-reproductive. They are between 0 and 14 years of age. So these three over here are main cast. They are going to be in the pre-reproductive category. Everyone in the center here, we got Fred and George, we have Sirius, we have the Wicked Witch of the West. They are still pretty young. They are working, and they are more in the reproductive years of their life. I'm not 100% sure what the ages of their characters are supposed to be, but I'm pretty sure that the ages of the actors fit fairly close. Gary Oldman might be in his 50s at the point where he did this role, but it's pretty close to being the 14 to 45 range for these actors. And then we have what's called the post-reproductive category. Individuals that have kind of aged out of those years where you would be starting a family, where you are likely to have kids. So post-reproductive would be anyone older than the age of 45, older than the age of 50 maybe. So we have McGonagall and Dumbledore and, of course, Gandalf, who is by far the oldest wizard here. So those are three age categories. Now, if this was an actual age structure diagram, it would be somewhat strange because we have three individuals in the post-reproductive category, 4 individuals in the reproductive category, 3 individuals in the pre-reproductive category, which means that the categories are all pretty even from stage to stage to stage. This indicates that the birth rate is fairly low. Depending on what the death rate is, this might mean that the population is likely to decline in the future, that it would actually shrink generation by generation. So now that you have the idea of these categories in your head, and admittedly that was a silly way to deliver that information, but forgive me, I'm a dweeb, let's take a look at some different kinds of diagrams that a given population could display. So for each of these diagrams, we have population cut up into 5-year segments. So 0 to up to the 5th year. So 4 years and 364 days old. So it's 5 years of time is the first slice, followed by the next 5 years, followed by the next 5 years. If you're 1 day older than that, you get into this first yellow slice and move on up at 5-year intervals. So the pre-reproductive years are these first 3 slices here at the bottom, and you'll notice on this one on the far left you have this wide base, and then you have a narrower yellow area, and it's like a pyramid. It's getting smaller and smaller as we go towards the top, and these diagrams are also divided into male and female, so you can also see in each age category at every 5-year slice what the relative proportion of men and women are, and that can give you interesting results as well. So what this shows you is that in the eldest generation, like a long time ago, we had a relatively small population. But that small population gave birth to the generation under it, which are the individuals in their reproductive years, those in the yellow slice. And obviously not all at once, right? All of the different 5-year slices slowly at different times gave birth to the individuals in the yellow slices. But there was enough of a population boom. They had large enough families that there's a larger chunk of the population in that yellow slice than there is in the blue part at the top. And then the individuals in that yellow slice also had relatively large families. The birth rate was higher than the death rate, so there are more young people in this population, more people in the pre-reproductive years than there are in the reproductive years. So this denotes, this pyramid-shaped one with the sides looking like curves, is a population that is expanding rapidly. This is very close to what you see in Guatemala, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, rapidly expanding population. Now this shows you, look at this, we're going to have all of these people who are currently children between the ages of 0 and 14, they're going to get older and they're going to enter the reproductive years. They're going to enter the workforce. We're going to need jobs. We're going to need resources. We're going to need educational services. We're going to need infrastructure, roads and things like that, energy resources. We need planning for these kind of things. So these age structure diagrams can help you know what you're going to require a few years down the road. It's one tool that you can use to plan things out. Now, in the United States, we actually have this second graph right here. This is pretty close to what we are working with. And these are hypothetical kind of models, so it's not going to perfectly match ours, but it's pretty close, which is expanding slowly. Still have the pyramid-shaped diagram where it gets larger and larger with each slice, but it's not a curving out structure. You don't have that kind of exponential growth going. It's more of a straight line down both sides. So that is a slowly expanding population age structure diagram. Over here, and this is common to Japan, Italy, and Greece, you have a stable age structure diagram. This is a situation where the population birth rate and the mortality rate, the death rate, is pretty much even with each other. So every generation is replacing the previous generation. We have a one-to-one match of births and deaths. So you can see that the sides of this diagram are flat. They look even. They look tucked in, such that we have almost the same number of people in each age category. And the only point at which it's shrinking is when they age into their elderly years and the mortality rate starts to increase as health complications begin to add up. Then way over here on the right, you have a declining population. That is to say that the population is decreasing over time. For the population to decrease over time, that means that you need to have a relatively low birth rate. So there's going to be a smaller number of offspring than there are individuals in their reproductive years. And this causes a kind of lopsided diagram, a top-heavy diagram, where there's more elderly people in the population than there are individuals in their working years to be able to take care of them. And then even fewer below that in terms of the pre-reproductive category. So it's unlike the other diagrams in that the sides are actually getting narrower and narrower as time goes forward. In a lot of countries where the population growth rate is negative, they promote immigration. They want workers to come in because they need economic stimulation. They need people to do the jobs, and particularly in elderly care for their aging population. So again, these kinds of diagrams or this kind of information can help you inform what sorts of policies you want to enact. So this age structure diagram was taken from China, 2014. And the thing to recognize about this is that the one-child policy was put in the 70s, so it takes effect about 40 years prior to when this data was collected. So if we start looking at the top, it looks like a rapidly growing population because look, each slice is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and it's curving outward as we go, getting larger and larger and larger. And if you notice, the female population is actually larger than the male population up here on the top. I actually, looks like I tabulated it down here. For people 65 and older, which is about 10% or more of the population, there was about 74 million female, about 67.9 million male. The numbers are a little bit more even for 55 to 64 years old. And part of the reason for that is that women tend to live longer than men do. And then you see that it gets to its widest point right around the 45-50 age category, people age 40 to 45, also pretty large number, and then sudden rapid decline in the number of individuals, right? This is when the one-child policy starts to go into effect. And there's a little bit of bounce back and forth, but then you see that it starts narrowing the sides, and you get the population age structure diagram that represents a declining population, a shrinking birth rate as a result. So you can actually see the effect of when this policy went in place in the age structure diagram. And not only that, if you take a look down here, right, you can see that the male population, this is 39 million here, and you can see that all of these bar graphs stick over this line. Over here, none of these three bottom bar graphs stick over this line over here on the female side. So you can also see the effect on which pregnancies are being selectively brought to term. Japan's a pretty good example of a country with a declining population. They have a lot of elderly people in their population, so you can see as time has marched forward that a larger and larger chunk of the population has shifted into the older age category, and you get a smaller portion of it in the pre-reproductive years. That's what this GIF is showing you, is Japan's population age diagram shifting over time. And that means that there are fewer adults working and paying taxes, fewer young people to support the elderly population, and that could mean that Japan could face some economic difficulties in the future. On this next slide, we have Nigeria on the right, which is a good example of a rapidly expanding population. You can see the curved out sides of the population getting larger and larger and larger with each generation. And then on the United States, this is a slowly growing population, but you can also see this giant bulge proceeding its way through. It starts down here and then it moves its way up, and it represents a population that is in their 50s and 60s right about now. So this is the baby boomer population coming through. And then it narrows out, and then it goes wide again with another large population that's following the baby boomers at about 30 years afterward, which is the children of the baby boomers. So you have Gen X and millennials following in their wake. Another interesting thing this diagram shows, which you should take note of, is look at the black line on each of these graphs. As time moves forward, look how the line is moving up for the United States. Because the baby boomers represented such a large portion of our population, that line is following behind them, and our population's average age is getting higher. On the right-hand diagram, however, even though by 2050 this is showing that Nigeria is projected to have a very similar population to the United States, you can see that the average age of people in that population will be much, much, much lower. And that's because they're experiencing rapid population growth, where a larger portion of their population will be in the pre-reproductive years, whereas we are experiencing slow population growth, and if it goes any slower, we could get declining rates of growth, where a lot more of our population is aging, so we are getting an older average age. So while the populations of these two countries is going to be very similar, the needs of those two populations is going to be very dissimilar. So population totals don't tell you the whole story. These age structure diagrams can give you a little bit better of an image.